Hello, everyone. It is Thursday, June 17th, 2021, and welcome to Status Check with Spivey, where we talk about life, law school, admissions, a little bit of everything. I'm Mike Spivey, the founder of Spivey Consulting Group, and today my COO, Anna Hicks, and I will be interviewing a current law school student, Amanda Bello. I can't think of someone better to interview in respect to how to do well in law school. I've known Amanda for 4 years. She was a 1L at Cornell Law School, where she was top 10%. She's transferred to Harvard Law School, where she did incredibly well. Harvard has a different grading system. I'm not going to get into it. Amanda did exceptionally well as a 2L at Harvard. She has summered both her 1L and 2L year at Gibson Dunn. I think the advice she gives is incredibly spot on for those about to enter law school. And we talk a little bit about the LSAT study process and applying to law school as well. So without further delay, let me hand it over to Anna and Amanda. I'm joined by not one, but two people who I know well today. Anna Hicks, the COO of our firm, who went to UVA Law School, and Amanda Bello, who I believe we've never met in person. Is that right, Amanda?
Yes, that's right. We've exchanged many emails.
Many emails and text messages. I think I was supposed to maybe speak at your school, undergrad at the University of Florida once, but COVID or something?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think it was COVID. I think maybe I was banned from the city of Gainesville. But It's great to see you. You are a rising Harvard 3L. Is that correct?
Yes. And it's very hard to believe that I'm already going to be starting my last year of law school. Exciting, but also a little sad too.
Kind of hard for me to believe. I think what Anna and I are going to try to do is dissect what it is that had you do so well at both Cornell, your 1L year, and then Harvard, your 2L years. Is that fair for you?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So a little bit of background information, and then I'll ask some questions about this, and then probably Anna will take over about law school stuff. What made you interested in law school in the first place?
Yeah. So as background, I don't have any lawyers in my family. So I'm definitely the opposite of someone who grew up surrounded by lawyers, surrounded by even people in corporate America. It's just not something that I was ever exposed to. So I definitely didn't grow up thinking about it as a potential career path. Wasn't someone who had always said that they wanted to be a lawyer or anything like that. It wasn't until I would say my freshman year of college that I kind of started thinking seriously about what I wanted to do. And the way that I thought about it was like, okay, what am I good at? What do I enjoy? And what career path lends itself to those things? So for me, it's just communicating, reading, writing. Those were always the sort of things that I found myself excelling at and that I found myself enjoying. And so I started to think about law school. And as you know, the University of Florida is a very pre-professional environment. A lot of people going to medical school, a lot of people going to law school and things like that. So if you want to find out about a career path, it was very easy to do at the school. So I just started getting involved in pre-law groups, and probably around my sophomore years when I really decided, okay, this is something I'm going to do. But at the time, I wasn't sure still what the paths within the law were. I just knew, okay, this is a place where maybe my skills will be useful and something that I'll enjoy because of those skills, but I didn't really know what the paths were. The big turning point for me, and I actually don't think we've talked about this before, was that I went to Test Masters LSAT training in between my sophomore and junior year. And so a lot of people that were training to be instructors were already in law school or had already had careers in the law. And so this was the first time that I met a lot of people who knew what they were really doing. And I was like, oh man, like I'm extremely uninformed about this. And luckily I became very close to someone who was also training with me. And that's where I found out about Big Law. And that's where I found out about deciding about going to a law school sort of based off of your chances of getting to do what you wanted to do. And so Big Law seemed really interesting to me because I love to be challenged and I love to be intellectually challenged specifically, but I also like stability. And so I wanted to go to a place, especially after making, a huge investment to go to law school and kind of a risk of being the first person to do that. I wanted a place that would be challenging and fun, but also a stable, well-established place to start off a career. And so that really attracted me to Big Law specifically. And I kind of made the plunge to go to law school particularly because of Big Law and getting to start off there.
Towards the end of this interview, we'll talk about Big Law because it's arguably the firm I know the best, Gibson Dunn. You mentioned LSAT prep. I'm curious both your and Anna's take. If you had one piece, and then I'll ask Anna the same question, of LSAT prep advice, just one, what would it be?
I would say my biggest piece of LSAT prep advice would be, to the extent possible, you have to treat it like it's your full-time job. And for a lot of people, I know that that's not possible. You might have an actual job or something like that. But for me, when I first started studying for the LSAT, I didn't give up the extracurricular activities that I was doing. I had a job. I was a full-time student. I had a social life. And so it ended up taking me a lot longer to get what I wanted, because when I first started, I didn't realize that I needed to really treat it like a full-time job to the extent possible. So I would say if you can eliminate something, plan to do that when you're going to start studying.
The way I always think of that elimination is every time you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. So
exactly.
If it's 3 months, 6 months, say no to a few things so you can say yes to your LSAT prep. Anna, any other input on the LSAT? I know you scored astronomically well as well.
My best piece of advice, and I was an LSAT tutor for a few years, is not to confuse quantity with quality. I see so many people who are like, I've taken 50 practice tests and I'm still not scoring where I want to be, but they're not necessarily reviewing those practice tests super well. They've just been flying through them. They are just trying to go through, as many questions as they can, as many tests as they can. But if you're not very carefully reviewing, if you're not really trying to understand, okay, why did I get this question wrong? Why are all of the wrong answers wrong? Why is the right answer right for every single question? You're not getting as much out of those practice tests as you could be. And there are limited numbers of practice tests, so you're wasting those in a way. So don't just try to run through as much material as possible. Try to be really smart about it. Try to really understand what you're doing for every single practice test, for every question that you're going over.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Something that someone told me was, if you couldn't teach a question to someone as though you were an LSAT instructor, you probably shouldn't move on from it yet. Like, you need to have the full ability to really explain. Even if you just got it right out of intuition, that's not going to help you when that intuition isn't coming into play on the day of the test. So if you really just sit there and can't explain to someone why the 4 wrong answers are wrong and why the 1 answer is correct, then you can confidently move on to something else.
Absolutely.
Great advice. So you're at UF. It's so interesting, Amanda, of all the colleges I visited, over 200, yours is the only one that keeps their football stadium unlocked 24/7. So I was in Gainesville a ton. I had friends I worked with at WashU and friends with the Flores Law School, Laura Rosenberry. So I was in Gainesville a bunch. I would always run that football stadium. Did you ever do that?
I did stadiums a few times, but it's not my favorite activity, to be honest with you, because of the Gainesville heat combined with probably what could be a better workout regimen for me. It doesn't always end up the best, but I did it a few times just to have the experience.
I have fond memories, but I was there at 5 a.m, so it wasn't that hot.
Okay.
But you're very involved, right? You were very involved as an undergrad. Well, you tell me, you were the president of multiple organizations. Is that right?
Yeah. So I became and I definitely don't think, of course, that this needs to be everyone's experience, but I felt like for me, because I was so unaware of the law, that I fully immersed myself in pre-law things specifically. Looking back, I feel like I could have done things maybe differently and gotten involved with more major specific things. But when I was at UF, I was involved with mock trial. So I directed a mock trial program and also competed in mock trial. Me and these other 2 girls who are now both in law school, we helped start this minority pre-legal society, which I'm really proud to say is still up and running today and has gone through multiple changes in power over time, which is really exciting. And I believe was the first of its kind at UF, which was pretty surprising. But that was really one of my favorite things to be involved with at UF, because, I love giving advice. And so getting to be part of an organization where I got to see people through the process when they were coming into the school, confused freshmen like I was great.
And the reason why I asked this question is it relates to what's the theme for the rest of this podcast, which is, do you think that being involved in these pre-law societies is fungible to your success at Cornell and Harvard Law?
That's a good question. I honestly, and I feel like people that are listening to this might agree, and it's crazy to say, but I think In a way, yes, because had I not been involved with these student organizations, I wouldn't have known to take test masters and I wouldn't have gone to that training and met these people. But I think that there's kind of like two different parts of the equation. One was the recognition that I didn't know things that I needed to know. And I think that realization came from being involved in pre-law organizations and then having sort of the impetus to find out more information. But I think the actual finding of the information happened on the internet, which is what I think a lot of people could definitely relate to. But I think for some people, it's that first exposure to the law and then realizing, okay, there's an information gap here that I need to correct. That's really important. And so immersing yourself in those student organizations can sometimes make you come to that realization. Whether or not the student organizations themselves will fill in the gaps correctly, I think is a different story.
Yeah, because you can see a scenario where they could actually harm if they're filling in the gaps incorrectly.
Exactly.
I do love the tautology, you don't know what you don't know. I think that's very applicable to most people applying to law school.
Amanda, did you do any academic preparation in the summer or spring or however long before law school? Did you try to familiarize yourself with the concepts of 1L classes? Did you do any other sort of academic prep? And if so, what did you do?
That's a good question. So I was a TLSer. So I read a lot of forums on TLS. And I would say that even on TLS, there's varying opinions in terms of what you should do in terms of prep. Some people say you shouldn't even look at, actual like information about the doctrinal classes. And other people read all of the E&E supplements before law school. For me, what I found helpful was I at least wanted to know what was going to be expected of me if I wanted to do well. And I knew from reading online that the law school exams are very different from anything that you've done before. Besides their actual content, just the fact that you have one test, most likely, that's going to be 100% of your grade was obviously something that was very scary to me. And so I was like, at the very least, I want to go into law school knowing how to take a law school exam, knowing what law school exams are about, so that when I do start off, I'm actually preparing consciously for this thing that I already know what it is. And so for me, I read, of course, Getting to Maybe was one that I read. I'm not sure that it was the most helpful book. I know it's a very popular choice, but I do think it helped me sort of acquaint myself. I looked at some practice exams online, and I just read a lot of forums that sort of explained, this is what a law school exam is. This is why it's different than other exams that you've probably taken. And I read forums that had explained what supplements are and why those might be helpful, but I didn't read the supplements and do anything that was actually relating to the specific material. And interestingly, Cornell, if I remember correctly, they waited a while to tell us what our classes would be in the fall for the express purpose of people not reading supplements in advance, which is interesting.
That's neat.
Yeah. Well, I do know a lot of folks in law school, whether it's professors or students, just like you said, discourage incoming 1Ls from trying to actually learn the substantive law just because you have such little framework for that yet. But it sounds like acquainting yourself with how exams worked and how sort of the general structure of law school worked was really helpful for you. Do you think that that was helpful for you?
Yes, I think that was so helpful. And I think the reason why it's particularly helpful is because when you finally start 1L, there are very few opportunities for the universe to confirm to you that you're on the right track, but there are plenty of opportunities for you to feel like what you're doing is completely wrong. And so if you haven't oriented yourself with a plan that you feel like makes sense and that you've confirmed has been successful for other people in the past, then if you get to law school, I think you can lose yourself a little bit. You might have a cold call that goes poorly, and so you start over briefing or briefing in general. You start to lose focus on the things that are actually going to be helpful for the exam because you get lost in the classroom experience, or you hear of somebody else that's doing this certain thing. And so you start to think, okay, should I be doing that as well? And so I think if you orient yourself before and you have a plan that you're comfortable with, and you can still course correct as the semester continues, but you know that this is something that works and that will work for you in particular, then I think you have a better chance at sticking with it and feeling comfortable and not getting lost in the noise of law school.
What's interesting is because of that lack of feedback, what it is you're not getting external positive feedback, but you're getting internal negative feedback. So we've interviewed several world famous psychologists. We'll link them in our blog that has this podcast, because I think that anyone about to start law school, listening to Dr. Guy Winch talk about rejection, listening to Dr. Gabor Mate and listening to Dr. Kristen Neff talk about self-compassion are really, really, really good things to do right before week one. You can remember orientation. Orientation is unlike anything else. It's like high school on steroids the first couple of weeks of law school.
Yes, I agree. And honestly, this kind of started with my LSAT prep. I think it's so important before you go to law school in terms of preparation to prepare your emotional state as well and just become really in tune with yourself. And I think you get even better at that as law school goes on and you have to deal with stressful situations that you may not have had to before. But I think just being really good at engaging with yourself on that emotional level, so you're constantly checking in with yourself, you have a much healthier and easier experience.
I'll quote Dr. Gabor Mate, who's written 4 best-selling books, so I'm going to guess he's a little bit better at this stuff than I am. He mentioned law school and he said, look, when you show up and you're looking at everyone, you're comparing your insides with their outsides. And what did he say, Anna? Let me tell you, their insides aren't much different than yours, something along those lines.
Yeah, I was talking about how you feel like you're the only one who is dealing with this imposter syndrome and anxiety and feeling like you have no idea what's going on and everybody else is projecting this confidence, but that's what they're showing on their outside. And a lot of people are feeling the exact same way as you are inside.
So you did really well at Cornell as a 1L. What would you attribute your performance to?
Yeah, so definitely knowing the exam in general and what comes with that. But then I think for me, in addition, being very particularized about the exams that you're going to be taking. So for instance, you're going to take, let's say, contracts with the specific professor. Once I first got to law school, I started talking to the 2Ls and 3Ls who took contracts with this professor, because as much as you can read supplements online that will give you general information about the doctrine, it's not going to be helpful if you don't know what your specific professor wants.
You said something very intriguing to me. You talked to 2Ls and 3Ls who took that professor. How did you go about that? There's extroverts, there's introverts, there's, I think, ambiverts would be the in-between. Did you just go up to random 2Ls?
Yeah, so I think I can be a little bit introverted sometimes, but when fear kicks in and I have this daunting exam that I know is coming up and I have loans to pay, I definitely actually at orientation randomly talked to one of the orientation leaders, found out that we had the same con law class when he was a 1L. And I was like, do you want to get coffee? And so we went to College Town Bagels in like my second day in Ithaca. And we were just talking about our con law class, and he sent me his outlines and we talked about what he thought worked when he took the class and what didn't. It's definitely a little bit awkward, but something that I've learned throughout law school and throughout being at a firm is you might feel really uncomfortable doing something. I can promise you someone else is out there doing it. And so I think for me, I'm always like, oh, I'm not going to reach out to this lawyer or this person. Like, this is so awkward and weird. But I know that my colleagues are probably doing the same thing, and everyone is here to try to be successful and get the best education possible. And so sometimes you just have to go for it.
For me, just a real quick note, I met a lot of 2Ls and 3Ls participating in activities, joining organizations, that sort of thing, which I was actually going to ask you about later, Amanda, but we can talk more about what you attribute your success to.
I did join student organizations too, and so they have like outline banks and things like that. But in terms of actually talking to people, just finding out what your professor expects and also what the format of the exam is going to be. Because the weird thing about law school is everyone knows the exam is really important, and the professors are just not going to even talk about the exam until it's like a month away. And so it's probably not the best idea to go up to your professor in the first week of school and ask what the format of the test is. It's not going to go over well. But you ask the 2Ls and 3Ls. And so for my contracts class, for instance, I knew pretty early on in the semester that I was going to have multiple choice and that was going to be like half of the grade. And that the essay was going to have a very tight word count, so like about 500 words. And a lot of law school exams are open word counts or very big word counts. And so you're kind of preparing a little bit differently for an exam that you know you're not going to just be able to sit there and write for hours. And you're preparing differently for something that you know is going to have multiple choice, because where you're usually focused on ambiguity and being able to write about different sides of an issue, when you're preparing for something that's multiple choice and you're studying throughout the semester, your eyes start to look towards things that have particular answers that can be right or wrong. So in contracts, of course, there's going to be probably a lot of damages questions if you have multiple choice, because that can just be a fixed number. If I knew that it was just going to be an open word count, I would have focused on things and studied differently.
You know, it's funny the way you're talking about being very specific to the class, being very specific to the professor, reminds me a lot of a story I've heard Mike tell before, just because we're on the phone 10 times a day. Mike, do you want to talk about the one law school class you've ever taken?
Sure. Yeah. So I wasn't a great undergraduate student like you two, but I think I was at the top or near the top of my class in business school, and at the top of my class in law school. I think I had the highest grade, an A plus. And I had a very specific method of graduate school preparation. Let me disclaim to the end of the earth, I would not say this is universal. I would not say, hey, audience, you should do this method that I did. It just happened to work for me. And I have no idea. You two can comment whether it would work in law school or not. I think there's basically two kinds of law school exams. There's the sort of unlimited word count, and then there's the racehorse one, I think people refer to. And then the second one is the limited word count. So maybe this would work better in sort of the opinion exams. I'll let you all talk about it. I just wanted to get that huge disclaimer out. Maybe don't do what I did, but this is what worked for me. So almost any human on the planet, at some point in time, they're going to share their opinion. So they might talk for weeks in business school or in law school about case or the facts, but at some point it's human nature to want to opine about what you're talking about from your perspective. And that's when I would just like wake the heck up, sit up really close attentively, and write down word for word every single word that professor was saying when it came to their opinion. And then when it came to the final, I would just spit their opinion back at them. Okay. Again, I don't know if this works or not, but this worked very well for me in business school, and it worked very well for me in the one law school class I took. And I'm curious your takes.
I don't know about the opinion side necessarily. And I'm not saying that as in I disagree with you. It's just not something that I have considered in that exact way before, especially not in the context of being in a law school classroom, just because that's not how I was thinking of it. But I do think it's extremely important to pay close attention to what your professors are actually telling you about what they want, what they think, what they believe. They're going to leave you breadcrumbs that are important because ultimately they're the one who's grading your exam. What do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, I 100% agree. And when I took notes, I would come into class with my notes in one color. And then anytime the professor said something, I would put it in blue so that when I looked back, I would know, is this something that I thought? Is this something that a supplement thought? Or is this something that my professor actually said? And I think that was really helpful and important. The only like word of caution that I would have is just always make sure that your exam is looking at things from multiple different perspectives, just so you can accumulate points. So even if what you ultimately land on is exactly what your professor would think, before you get to that point, you kind of proof it out and show this is the other side of the argument, and you can explain why it's wrong. And hopefully that's your professor's opinion of why this is wrong or why the policy favors us landing on this side of the coin. But I think just make sure that sort of before you settle on whatever your professor's conclusion is, that you show why that conclusion is the best one.
I was going to ask you, Amanda, if you were in any study groups your 1L year. Did you study with others on a regular basis or occasionally, or what did your sort of study process look like as it pertained to other people, your classmates?
Yeah, so I'm definitely a solo studier. And I think it's important to know what you are, because I think a lot of people like to study together. And so you might feel like you have to study together in order to do well. But I felt like for me, a lot of the people that I happened to become friends with weren't on the same study approach that I was on. And so when I did initially study in the library, apart from the fact that it really overwhelmed me many times to study in the law school library. So I started going to undergraduate libraries, but I just felt like none of us were really getting 100% of what we wanted out of it, because some people were briefing the cases and wanted to maybe talk about the facts of cases a little bit more than I wanted to. I just wanted to read a supplement or take a practice exam. And so I think had I had a great stroke of luck where I would have met people that were on the exact same wavelength as me, I think I definitely would have been down to do that. But I think it's because I realized quickly, okay, we're kind of having different approaches and we study differently. And so I mainly studied by myself.
I think that's such an important point, that you should not just be doing what other people are doing. I think that there is so much of that in law school, so much of the comparing yourself, even if it's outside of the context of a study group. If you hear, oh my God, this person's outlining already and it's only October or whatever it is, you feel like I should be outlining. But I think it's so important, exactly what you said. You need to do what is right for you. You need to do your own study style. You need to figure out what works the best for your understanding, as opposed to sort of constantly benchmarking yourself against what everybody else is doing. But I actually was going to ask about the outlining timeline. When did you start outlining during your 1L year? What did sort of that process look like? And could you briefly describe outlining for anyone who's listening who doesn't know what it is?
So outlining, it's interesting because I feel like outlining is just such like an ominous term that kind of casts a shadow over you throughout all of your first semester. But it's really not that different than anything that you've done when you were making like a study guide for a course. So essentially, I would say it's a condensed version, an organized version of your notes that walks through the course. And I think when you start reading, if you go on TLS or other sort of law school help websites, you'll sort of quickly see that people have opinions on outlines and what's actually effective and what's not effective. I would say there's two different outlines that probably most people will have in law school. One of them is the long outline that's like 100 pages and is very detailed. And another version is your exam outline. So for most law school classes, you're allowed to have your materials with you during the exam. And so your exam outline would be a condensed version that's helpful when you see a question for you to immediately turn to that issue in your outline and refresh yourself quickly about what are the elements or the factors and things like that. And so I have to be honest, I think in terms of outlining was what I had the most questionable experience with in law school. Throughout my first semester, I changed my perspective on outlining several times. At first, and I don't know why I had this opinion, but at first I was like, I need to make all of my outlines from scratch. This is just what I'm going to do because this is what's going to help me study. And I think to an extent that's true. I think writing an outline can help you to digest the information. But I kind of realized as I started doing that, oh, this seems to me like I'm wasting a lot of time, that I'm never going to look at this document again in my entire life. And so at a certain point in the semester, I switched my mentality and I realized, okay, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Thousands of people have taken all of these classes before me, people probably smarter than I am. Let me get those outlines instead, and I'm just going to start editing them. So I think at the end of the day, as long as you sort of know what your end goal is, like what you need to get out of the outlining process and the outline, you can do whatever works for you. And so there's two things that you need to do. And one is, of course, you have to know the material well. And so when you think back to what's helped me learn material before in other classes, if it was writing it by hand, if it was putting it all into a document and that helped it get into your head, then maybe doing an outline from scratch is for you. But if actually taking practice exams throughout the year to help you sort of apply it in real time is what helped you, then maybe that will work better for you instead. And then the second part is knowing what your day of exam taking approach is going to be. So having an exam attack outline that really helps you say, okay, if I see an equal protection issue on my con law exam, this is what I have to walk through. Or if I see a commerce clause problem, if I see a contracts hypothetical, where someone made an offer and then XYZ happened, like how would I approach that? I think that's the second step. I think what you do in between to get there can vary depending on the person. You have to know the information cold, because you're not really going to have time to look for an outline. So do whatever you need to do to get there. And then secondly, you're going to have limited amount of time on the exam. And so knowing how you would answer an exam question and sort of what points you need to hit and having an attack outline on the day of can help you purposefully walk through that before the exam. And if you get nervous during the test, you can use that as a quick and efficient crutch.
I wanted to ask you about sort of general wellness during 1L, taking breaks, what you did sort of completely outside of the academic side of law school entirely, because I think that it's so easy to focus on what were your specific study habits? What did you do for this class? What did you do for this professor? When a big part of doing well in your 1L year is just sort of being able to upkeep yourself as an emotionally and mentally well human, which can be really difficult during 1L when there's sort of a culture of study as hard as you can and everyone's trying to do really well. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that and sort of what you did specifically.
Right. I think, that's so important. There's this quote that's like, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And I think that that is really important in terms of law school prioritizing. There is 100% time to do things outside of law school. Are you going to be able to do every single thing that you want to do? Probably not. And so I think what becomes really important is you knowing what activities are actually going to contribute to your wellness. And so you might be someone who does like to socialize a lot. And so you're always looking forward to that Friday night bar tab, and because you know that's going to energize you and make you feel better. Or you might be closer to me, or for me, if I have a couple of hours to decompress and watch a show, that adds to my energy. If I have time to go to dinner with one good friend and have a good conversation about life, that's going to make me feel better during the week. And so I think being very, very purposeful in that. And like you were saying, there's a lot of pressure all the time outside of academics too. There will be pressure for you to maybe go to that bar tab, which sometimes I would, but sometimes I would be like, okay, I have a very limited amount of time. Is this really going to make me feel better going into Monday? And for some people, the answer is absolutely yes. This is how I relieve stress. For me, sometimes it would add to my stress more. And so I think it was just knowing what actually is going to make me happy. And during my 1L, I actually started a relationship with someone. And that, of course, takes a lot of time. So I had plenty of time. Like I had enough time to get to know someone really well and then start dating them while I was at school. So it's definitely possible. Would I have had time to do that and have a really great exercise routine and socialize and watch all my shows? Probably not. But that's one thing that I was prioritizing at the time, and it worked out well. I would also say when you have that established plan of how you're going to do well on exams or how you hope to do well on exams, you can cut out a lot of the noise of what other people are doing. And it's not that what they're doing isn't going to serve them well. It's just that you don't have to do what you're doing and what they're doing and what this other person is doing at the same time. And so for me, for instance, like I relied on supplements like very heavily, and that cut out a lot of time because I wasn't briefing cases and doing very in-depth reads of old cases from the 1800s. If I could just very quickly look it up on the internet and figure out what was going on much faster. And so I think knowing about those time-saving strategies in advance gave me a lot more time to just relax than I would have had I not known to do that.
I got all the time. So I worked at 3 law schools before I started this firm, Vanderbilt, WashU, and Colorado. And when I went from Vanderbilt to WashU, a question I got almost every day of my life was, what's the difference between Vanderbilt students and WashU students? At the time, I think Vanderbilt was probably ranked 3 or 4 spots higher. It's kind of a hilarious question because what 3 or 4 points on an LSAT or 2 points on an LSAT is really just the luck of any given day. But I know our listeners are going to be interested in this, rightfully so. So you transferred from Cornell to Harvard. You go from a 1L to Cornell to a 2L to Harvard. Is there any palpable difference? I'm sure there are some, and I'm sure there's some things that are surprisingly similar.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I think about this all the time, I think law school can be very stressful because you're around so many smart people and you can feel inadequate. But for me, like I feel so lucky at both schools that I went to just be surrounded by so many people who are so smart. I definitely don't think that there's a palpable difference in that sense between Cornell and Harvard. I think you're consistently impressed by the things that your classmates say. I would say a difference, and it's hard to pinpoint if it's the transition from Cornell to Harvard or the transition from 1L to 2L. I would say things at HLS are for me more relaxed. And I think that that might have a lot to do with being a 2L instead of a 1L. But I also think that there may be a sense of security at Harvard that people have that perhaps makes them more relaxed, or maybe the fact that it's a bigger class of like 560 people. You don't maybe notice as much some of the stressful things that you notice when you're around a smaller group of people. But I can genuinely say if anyone has any concerns about going to Harvard, it has been the most collaborative environment I have had. I have met genuinely the nicest people. I have had people who are traditional 1L students who started off Harvard as 1Ls reach out to me and send me messages about how impressed they are that I transferred and how I should feel very comfortable at the school. I've had people go out of their way to get me involved in student organizations, to help me with clerkship application processes, to get me to know professors. I would just say that was the most shocking thing to me, was to get to Harvard, be very afraid, and just be met with so much genuine support. It was honestly the best decision of my entire life to go to Harvard.
I would also posit that from my experience on the other side of things, being an administrator at multiple law schools, there is, to me, a noticeable difference between the self-security of 1Ls versus 2Ls.
Mm-hmm.
As you clicked on, that might not necessarily be a Cornell versus Harvard thing. That also might very well be largely correlated with 1L versus 2L. You have your smaller pack. They're not ostracizing you. There's no need to impress anymore. You have your group. Although for you, maybe you had to develop a second pack. So that's interesting enough. So you go from large classes now, and this is not just someone who transferred. The law school class I took was a 3L seminar of 12 people. How does that dynamic change your study methods?
It changes it a lot. You know, I talk to 1Ls and I'm always like, you're going to miss being a 1L. And of course, they don't believe me. But I think the resources online for 1L are incredible. Someone has written about every single possible 1L subject in great detail. When you start taking seminars and sort of courses that are just in line with a professor's very specific interests, you lose that ability to Google things, to find a forum about something, to find a book about this particular thing. And you sort of have to rely on the actual classroom experience a little bit more than you had to during 1L. So during 1L, if you asked me, where did you get the least information that was helpful for an exam, I would say in class. That definitely changes during 2L because there is no supplement for this very niche seminar on American legal history in this certain time period. And so I would say that is what changes the most. If the class has an exam at the end still, I don't think the skills to do well on an exam change from 1L to 2L. I just think you might need to develop a new approach to where you're getting your information from. And you might have to be writing papers versus writing an exam at the end. But the same things that we were talking about before in terms of knowing your professor, those remain true. And so if you're going to have an essay that you turn in, you talk to people who have written that essay in a different semester and ask what worked for them and get to know your professor in office hours. And so you might be getting information slightly differently or have less information available to you, but I don't think the skills that you developed during 1L change too much. It's just, in some ways, it's a little bit harder, but it all balances out because you're less stressed out.
I think the old mantra is, and tell me if this has changed, 1L year, they scare you to death, 2L year, they work you to death, and 3L year, they bore you to death. So what are your expectations and what do you want to get out of your third year?
Yeah, so of course, as a transfer student, you're starting anew in some ways. In the biggest way, meeting professors. So if you are someone who wants to clerk eventually, like I do, or do something else that requires you to get letters of recommendation, you have to start a year behind everybody else. And you have to start without any grades from that school to kick off an application to an RA job or something like that. So when I started at HLS, I knew that if I just blended into the background, I would only exist in the background. Nothing was going to pull me out of that. So if I just wanted to sort of hide and not talk to professors, not talk to other people, I could do that and I could graduate and I'd have the same degree and no one would be the wiser except for me. And so I made a very purposeful effort when I started 2L to, especially during the pandemic, to get extremely involved, to take smaller classes, to go to professors' office hours and do things like that. And so I was able to actually get close to 3 professors during my 2L who are all willing to write letters of recommendation. But of course, I feel like I only know them through Zoom. And so I think for me during my 3L, it's strengthening those relationships and fostering new relationships with professors that's really important to me. And I think 2L is a good year where you start maybe thinking about what interests you subject matter wise. And then 3L can be a good opportunity to really hone that in. So for me, I really like soft intellectual property and I like appellate litigation. Of course, I love Gibson, great at both of those. And so sort of realizing that throughout 2L and throughout my 1L summer, and then using 3L to connect with professors who are experts in those spaces and to just get more acquainted with those areas of the law.
It's a good transition point to talk about your career aspirations, career goals. I know you're going to be at Gibson Dunn. That's accurate, right? You have an offer?
Yes. So I had an offer to come back this summer. And usually when people do a 1L summer at a firm, they end up splitting their 2L summer with a different firm. But I truly love Gibson. And I had a very weird summer last summer because it was virtual during the pandemic, only 6 weeks long. And so I decided not to split this summer, just do the full 10 weeks at Gibson. And so hopefully at the end of the summer, I will get an offer to come back to their New York office after graduation. But yeah, that's definitely the plan.
Okay, good gracious. I hope I didn't jinx it. My experience as also a former dean of career services, if you spend your 1L and 2L summer, you're probably in a good way. I can think of a student that was sitting in his office with his shirt off for no reason because I guess he said it was hot and he never got a full offer. So I think beyond the weird spectrum of anomalistic things people can do, I feel very confident.
The one I heard about someone who didn't get an offer after their 2L summer at a firm was that they got really drunk at a firm party and jumped in the Hudson River just for fun. So don't do that, Amanda. That's my advice to you based on my 0 big law experience.
I actually heard that story recently. I think that one goes through the grapevine.
That's a legend. That's an all-time legend.
There's sadly a million drunk stories. I mean, I was a dean of career services about students not getting job offers. When I was in business school, to me, I mean, I was in my 20s. He seemed ancient and wise, but maybe he was my age now. But he seemed like he was 85 and super wise. I don't remember that much advice from business school. It's just so many years ago. But I do remember what this guy said. He was the CEO of a large company. I mean large. I mean like ExxonMobil or something crazy. And he said that every business meeting he had ever attended, dinner, party, whatever, his entire career, he would have one drink and then he would switch to tonic water. Because his point was he saw too many careers sabotaged by people who didn't do that and said the wrong thing at the wrong time. So I don't think you're going to make that mistake. Amanda, I've known you well enough just for 3 or 4 years via texting and emailing. What are your sort of long-term career goals and expectations? Have you talked to my mentor? I have 2 mentors, but one of them is the sort of rainmaker for Gibson Dunn's M&A group, Jeff Chapman. But do you want to follow Jeff's footsteps or are you going to go in I think maybe you're going to go in an opposite direction?
Right. We talked briefly last summer, just introductory, but yes, we have that corporate litigation split. I think, it's hard to say where I will be 5 years from now. I really love the firm and I really find everything that I do very interesting. So even when things are hard, which of course they're going to be hard at a big firm, when you find everything that's sort of surrounding the project enjoyable, you end up getting a lot out of it because you're just excited. You're excited by the clients, you're excited by the problem, you're excited when you're at a place like Gibson about getting to work with these insanely intelligent people that you're surrounded by all of the time and fellow Summers as well. And so I never thought that I would stay at a firm long term, but so far I really like it. And so I'm definitely keeping that option open. I just think I see myself as a litigator, though. I've tried to be open to the corporate side of things, but I loved law school. I like doing legal research. I like writing memos. I like the adversarial nature of a litigation. And so I think those are all things that have sort of steered me in that direction. And when you talk to corporate folks, they might say, I didn't like that part of law school. I don't like the adversarial nature of litigation. I want to be collaborating with people towards some common end goal of us all feeling satisfied with this transaction. And so I think knowing what your personality is and how you kind of want your role in the law to be is helpful. And for me, everything has sort of pushed me towards litigation.
Are you worried about burnout, Amanda? I think a lot of people, I saw someone tweet the other day, something hilarious about the thing I really liked about being associated at a big law firm was how similar they treated us to when we were Summers. Right, that's a joke.
Yeah. So I will say, maybe we can talk about this again once I'm actually an associate and maybe I'll have a different perspective. But I would say when I first experienced burnout, interestingly, it was actually with the LSAT. And that's because, like I had mentioned, I had to start studying for it again after having done it incorrectly the first time around. And so for me, it was the act of doing the exact same thing for like a year and a half that made me very tired, like waking up, taking a practice exam, checking it, like just living that same repetitive life. At a certain point, I couldn't even look at an LSAT question anymore without feeling fatigued. And I think what's been interesting so far at the firm is you get exposed to a lot of different problems in a very fast pace. And so you might be tired, but you're not burnt out in the sense of, I can't continue doing this because I've just been looking at the same thing for so long, because you're constantly, even if you're working on the same general matter, it's kind of exciting to get exposed to different things consistently. And so that kind of sort of helps to negate that feeling of burnt out about one specific thing, if that makes sense.
So 3 things about, I think, that are universal, 2 about law school and 1 about jobs in general. And I'm actually curious, honest take, after I say the things about jobs in general, honest take about Spivey Consulting. In law school, most everyone is going to be intelligent. Now, there's going to be some outliers who are hyper intelligent, but generally the default is everyone's really smart. There's no better way of looking at it. Most people are going to be hardworking during a law school. One of the reasons why we wanted to interview you is there's people who are both smart and hardworking who don't do great in law school. We wanted to figure out what's the extra dimensions that contribute to this. And then the third thing that we're clicking on now is, and this isn't just big law, and it's not just law firms, this is the professional world in general. There are times in life where you have to grind. So when I was a decanal position, a dean in charge of multiple departments in law schools, I had wonderful fancy dinners with college presidents, but I also had days where I had to lock myself in the office at 6 a.m. till some ungodly hour or 11 at night and just grind. The day I started Spivey Consulting, I remember looking out the window when it was light outside and I said, holy cow, I've been up all night working on various documents. And Anna, I'm guessing you're going to say, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I mainly have my professional experience with Spivey Consulting, which definitely aligns with what you said. As much as there is an immense amount of work-life balance that I do get out of working with Spivey Consulting and being able to work from home and all of that, there definitely are those times just when a lot of things add up at the same time, or there's a crisis or something happens when you just have to grind. That's all there is. You just have to put the time into it, and it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort. And that sort of is what it is. I think what is really helpful, and what admittedly some of my big law friends have struggled with, is that at Spivey Consulting, I can always look forward to a time when it's going to be less of a grind. So I can recognize, okay, I'm in this now, but there's a point in the very near future when it's going to be over and when I can go back to sort of more of my normal life, and I'll be able to recharge then. And I also think what's very helpful in getting through those times is really having a good infrastructure in your life for still taking care of your basic needs, staying generally well. So if you're just well in your habits of, you wake up, you go for a run, you have your breakfast, whatever it is for you, I think continuing to do those things and just already having that in your schedule, in your habits, I think is so helpful for those times when you're really just having to grind.
Good advice from both you all. I also do want to say what Amanda said about variety helping prevent burnout is very true for me. I'm always trying to think of new projects to do just to add sort of variety to prevent against burnout. Any final thoughts, Amanda, you would tell? So our listeners are primarily going to be either people about to start law school or people about to start the admissions process? And I'll ask you both, any final pieces of advice for that group of listeners?
Sure. So I think for the people who are about to start law school, I would just say from listening to this podcast, you've got my perspective and what helped me. There are many different ways to be successful in law school. There are also ways to be unsuccessful, though. And so I think you never want to take it too far as, okay, well, we're just going to do what works for us. That's true, but you also have to do what's going to work for like the task at hand at the same time. And so just recognizing that you know what the end goal is, you're working towards that end goal, you're just doing it in the way that works best for you, I think is important. But they're kind of two separate problems there. So I would say my biggest advice is just figure out what it is that you need to do to succeed on a test generally, and then be very introspective as to what is going to help you specifically effectuate that goal. That would be my biggest piece of advice. For the people who are starting the law school admissions process, I would say savor the time before law school to the extent possible. I know it's been a very stressful law school admissions cycle from what I've seen so far. So I know that's definitely easier said than done. But I would say the same advice that's true for succeeding in law school is going to be true for staying healthy during the admissions process, which is get the information that you need to get from resources like this and from people who have come before you, but also just consistently stay in tune with yourself, because if you experience that sort of severe burnout before law school because you were so perhaps preoccupied with things that were outside of your control, it's going to be hard to find that motivation again once law school actually begins. So definitely, to the extent possible, of course, easier said than done, enjoy the time before this all begins.
I could not possibly agree with you more. I think it's so easy in this process, whether it's applying or being in law school or taking the bar. There's so much of this where you're looking forward to sort of the next thing. You're waiting for your LSAT score and you're just, oh my gosh, like there's so much anxiety. I'm waiting for my LSAT score to come out, and then it comes out. And then you're looking at the next thing. You're waiting for school to get back to you. You're waiting for 1L to start. You're waiting to hear back from positions. I think it's just so easy to get caught up in the anxiety of the waiting and looking at the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. I think it's really, really important, exactly as you said, Amanda, to sort of live in your present also, to appreciate what you're doing right now, because you are always, for so long, you are going to be waiting for the next thing, and you can catch yourself in an endless loop of that. The only other thing I would add is something that really, I think, Mike, our interview with Dr. Guy Winch came out of that, is that you are going to be rejected from things in this process, whether it's law schools or jobs or getting a grade that isn't what you hoped, whatever it is, you are going to feel rejected in various parts of this process. And I think it's so important to remember that those rejections are not and cannot be rejections of you as a person. They don't know who you are as a person. They don't know your whole being. What they're rejecting is an application. What they're rejecting is some pieces of paper. And that is not a rejection of who you are. That's a rejection of one tiny sliver of the whole human being that you are. So I think it's so important not to internalize the rejections that you get, because everyone gets them. I think it's so important not to internalize those as judgments of who you are as a person.
My final input would be, the podcast I listen to every week is something called The Drive by a medical doctor, Dr. Peter Attia, who either at some point is going to start paying me royalties or file a restraining order. I plug his podcast so often. But so Dr. Attia talks a lot about longevity, mental well-being, physical well-being, et cetera. And he's always saying something that holds true to this entire conversation we just had, which is any one intervention for one of his patients may be the most beautiful, elegant, effective thing he's ever done. And then you take patient number 2, same exact intervention, it has no benefit. And that's very applicable to the human body. We're all different people. It's also very applicable to how one person does well and maybe another person has a different method. So this conversation, incredibly illuminating. I thank you both. But that doesn't mean that someone shouldn't go to law school and try what works best for them, particularly if you already know works best for you. If you have a 4.0 and you crushed it in undergrad, yeah, law school is different. A JD is not an advanced BA. But, try what works for you. Don't just say, oh, well, this person was able to transfer to Harvard, so I'm going to use their method. Use the method that works is my final piece of advice. Thank you both for your time. And I'm pretty sure we're going to stay in touch. And Amanda, I'm pretty sure we're going to stay in touch too. Deal?
Yes, deal. Thank you.
Thank you
Great
so
being
much,
here.
Amanda. Bye, everyone.